Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for this emergency town hall on the new Anti-Transgender Memo on Florida's driver's licenses and IDs, hosted by Equality Florida with our partners at Southern Legal Counsel. My name is Quinn Diaz, my pronouns are they, them, and I am the Public Policy Associate at Equality Florida. As you likely know by now, the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles released a memo earlier this week about gender markers on driver's licenses, changing a long-standing policy. This was not an official rule adoption. At the same time, there is also a separate bill moving through the state legislature that addresses sex on driver's licenses and IDs. These are two different issues happening simultaneously, but they're both focused on the state conflating sex and gender. We know this has generated significant confusion and fear, and we hope to provide some clarity tonight, what we know, what we don't know, and what we expect. To help us sort through this, we have Simone Chris and Carlos Guillermo Smith. Simone is the Director of Transgender Rights Initiative at Southern Legal Counsel. Her pronouns are she, her, hers. Simone specializes in federal impact litigation, policy advocacy, and community education. She has led numerous name and gender marker change clinics and was recently named as one of the National LGBTQ Bar Association's 40 Best LGBTQ Lawyers Under 40. Carlos is the Senior Policy Advisor for Equality Florida. His pronouns are he, him, and elle. He previously served in the Florida House of Representatives, where he was the first openly LGBTQ Latino lawmaker and a fierce advocate for LGBTQ rights. Thank you both for joining us this evening. So Carlos, starting with you, let's start with the DHSMV memo. We're going to get into the different implications in a minute for people in different situations, those who have a license, those who are seeking to renew, those who don't yet have one. But let's start with the basics. This seemed to happen really abruptly. So where did this news come from?
Yeah, it feels like it came out of nowhere, right? Thank you, Quinn, for breaking all of this down. As most of you already know, which is why you're joining us today, the DHSMV, they released a really, really short letter on the 26th of January to the tax collectors, along with a technical advisory, basically rescinding what their previous policy was, which allowed for Floridians to update their gender marker on their driver license or their state ID with supporting documentation. You've probably already seen this letter circulated around social media. This was basically them announcing that they will no longer be amending gender markers on Florida driver licenses and IDs to reflect someone's gender identity. This is not a formal rule that was developed through public input or public comment like we usually see in public notice. So we don't really have a formal record like we should to fully understand how they will be implementing this policy. We also have received, unfortunately, little to no comment from the department that issued this with perhaps a clarification to help us understand the full scope and the implications of what they're doing. But what we do know is that this is just another politically motivated attack to sow fear and exclude transgender Floridians from public life. That's why we're here. We're here to make sure that folks know that they are not alone, to try to answer as many of the questions as we can to help guide you through some of these new attacks on your rights and dignities.
Thank you, Carlos. So Simone, help us understand the context here. Before this latest memo, what has the department's recent policy been when it comes to whether a transgender person can get a driver's license with an affirmed gender marker?
Yeah, thank you. So prior to this, and I'm not even going to call this a policy, this memo and technical advisory, the policy that the DHSMV followed was one that we advocated for years ago to bring their policy into alignment with the federal regulations, so Social Security amendments, passport amendments, et cetera. So all that was required was a letter from a medical provider attesting to the person's gender. So for the past, since about 2018, folks have been able to amend their gender markers on their licenses to have legal authenticity that reflects who they truly are. And, you know, I know just through our website that we created alone, the Florida name change website, just through that, we've had over 70,000 people go through the legal name and gender marker change process. So there's a
Wow.
substantial number of people in the state of Florida that are operating today with a driver's license or ID that does reflect their gender identity.
I just want to reiterate that too. We think more than 70,000 Floridians have already updated their driver license or ID with their updated gender marker to reflect their gender identity. That's a substantial and significant number of people.
Thank you, Carlos. That's right. Okay, Simone, so we have this memo that now says the department is rescinding this previous policy. We know there's a lot of uncertainty, but let's start out with what this likely means for people with driver's licenses or IDs that have an affirming gender marker that doesn't reflect their sex at birth. Is that existing driver's license still valid?
Yes. So I want to be very clear, because there is so much misinformation, and not even misinformation, just there's a lack of information. And like with every policy, rule, law we've seen, from the Don't Say LGBTQ law through today, the intent is to create fear and to make us not understand what our rights are, so that we err on the side of caution. And vagueness and ambiguity is the point. So I want folks to understand very clearly that there is no reason to believe whatsoever that a person who has a valid, not expired driver's license or ID that reflects their gender identity is at any risk of civil or criminal penalties. And that's because of several things. Number one, you cannot possibly be charged with fraud or misrepresentation of information or withholding of information if you amended your gender marker in compliance with, according to, the policy that existed at the time. And before a few days ago, the very clear actual policy, not like a random memo from a random guy, but the actual policy that existed allowed you to update your gender marker with that letter. So everyone that has updated their gender marker previously, you have no reason to fear that you're going to be subjected to civil or criminal penalties. It's the folks who, you know, need to renew their license or have lost their license and need to replace it. Those are the folks for whom it's a little more ambiguous. And I know we're gonna get into that in a minute. But I really want folks to understand that, like, if you have a driver's license or ID that already has the correct gender marker on it, reflecting your gender identity, please don't go turn in your driver's license or amend it back, or, you know, stop going to work because you're afraid to drive. If anyone is impacted by this, if anyone does, let me be very clear. Like, I'm giving you my best legal interpretation of all the statutes they cited, having reviewed all of their policies, having been engaging with them for many years on this. But there's no way to know exactly what they're actually going to do. So I'm not saying there's no world in which someone could have some civil or criminal penalty applied, but that is not what is contemplated within the text of this, nor is it permissible under the laws and the actual enforcement mechanisms in place. And if anyone is impacted by this in any way, please reach out to me. But that is not what we expect to happen or what is allowed under this.
So, yeah, so just to clarify real quick, if I could, thank you, Quinn. So to be clear, of the more than 70,000 Floridians who have already updated their driver license or ID with an updated gender marker to reflect their gender identity, they should, for now, not have to worry about having their license or ID suspended. They shouldn't have to worry about driving to work with that ID being what they use the driver license to drive to work. They shouldn't worry about facing criminal penalties just because they have an ID that has been updated in compliance with this rule.
Thank you, Carlos. So Simone, let's go back to that example we were just discussing earlier. So what about the people who have existing affirming driver's licenses and are coming up for a renewal for a new ID, or they lost their ID and need a replacement reissued? Do we know what that process would look like under this memo?
So it's really important. I'm so glad that you just phrased it that way, because it's super important we understand there's a difference between renew and replace. So what they have done is tried to, before this law may or may not pass, the biological sex bill that they're looking at, that would ban, these amendments. Ahead of that, the only loophole they could find for which to do this cruel and unjustifiable action is by saying, oh, actually, this whole time when we were replacing licenses, when gender marker amendments were requested, we shouldn't have been doing that, because a replacement is only for if you lose it, if it's stolen, or if you're changing your name or address, right? So they're acting like, oops, we were making a mistake for all those years before. But because they tried to fit it in that loophole and be tricky, what they did is cabin themselves to, this is just for replacements. It doesn't say renewals. Renewals are completely separate. So if you've already updated your gender marker, you aren't amending it, you aren't replacing it, you are renewing it, which you can do online. There's nothing in here that has any affirmative duty of someone to go in and out themselves and be like, hey, by the way, in case you were wondering, this does not reflect what was on my original birth certificate. And there's nothing in here that requires you to do so. So for folks that are renewing, first of all, I suggest doing it online just because it's easier, but also that is a completely separate process than what they're talking about. And if folks haven't seen it, there's an email from this person named Molly Best, who's the director of communications at the DHSMV. This is a public, this is an agency statement on behalf of the agency that's just as binding as this memo that is also doesn't have legal authority or weight. And what she said very clearly is that the rescission of the policy we had put in place previously pertained solely to replacement license requests. So she says right there, that doesn't include renewals. And then she goes on to say no changes have been made to the process of establishing gender on a newly issued Florida license. So we'll get into that in a second, but these are their words, and they might regret them, but this is what they've put out there. And so we don't have any reason to believe folks who are renewing their license will have any issue, nor folks who are, again, getting a first-time license.
Thanks so much for that. Would that answer change depending on whether someone already has other documents, like a passport that does reflect their gender identity?
Great question. So if you look at the technical advisory, which is the closest thing to like a legitimate policy change, and I'm using air quotes because they didn't go through the administrative rulemaking process. No. This isn't a legislative enactment. It's a technical advisory, right? Which most people would never even know existed. All it says, that memo is separate. All the technical advisory says is the customer's gender as displayed on the driver's license or ID must be taken from a primary identification document. Not should be or maybe, must be. Under their own rule, under their own language, if you have a passport, which is a primary identification document that you've already updated to reflect your gender marker, or even if you haven't yet, go do that. Go update it. You can update your passport to reflect your gender identity, and you don't even need a doctor's letter. It's self-attestation. So if you have a passport, or let's say you've already updated your birth certificate, also a primary identification document, and that says your correct gender marker, you're reflecting your gender identity, by their own words, they must put that gender marker on your driver's license or ID. Again, this might be sloppy drafting. It might not be what they intended, but it's what it says. And so, yes, it does matter if you've already updated your passport or birth certificate. So for folks that are applying for a first-time driver's license, as long as their passport or birth certificate say the correct gender marker, that is what should appear on their license. For folks who have a current driver's license or ID and it doesn't reflect their gender identity, it reflects their sex assigned at birth, those are the folks for whom this is probably going to preclude them from amending their gender marker, which is a replacement. However, that the refusal to amend it and replace it conflicts directly with the statement that it must reflect what's on your primary identification document. So they're going to have to figure out how to work within that conundrum that they've created for themselves.
Thanks, Simone. Carlos, I knew you were about to dig into some ramifications regarding the specific language in the memo about fraud.
Yes. Well, as you know, and as a lot of folks who are watching this know, who read the letter, there was a lot of threatening language in that letter. There's, as a result of that threatening language, there's a lot of fear in the community about this decree from the DeSantis administration, especially in response to that language right at the end, where the state describes misrepresenting one's gender constituting fraud and subjecting trans folks in Florida to potential criminal or civil penalties. It seems like they put this language in there on purpose to create fear and anxiety within the transgender community. Can folks be accused of fraud or be subject to these criminal or civil penalties that they talk about in the letter if they complied with not necessarily the state's previous policy, but if they complied with the state's current policy that says that these primary identification documents, which include a birth certificate or a U.S. passport, which can be amended to reflect their gender identity, can they be accused of fraud if they are giving them these updated documents that have been amended to reflect their gender identity?
Not unless they put out additional guidance, any sort of binding authority saying such, because as it stands currently, they have made clear that it has to reflect what's on their primary identification document. So in fact, I think you're more should be more likely to get accused of fraud if you're not, you know what I mean? If you're not doing exactly what it says and giving them a primary identification document, or if they were to refuse to use that gender marker because that's what it says. I want folks to also know, I think the language is really scary, and all the folks that are really concerned about this, I didn't mean to sound flippant at all earlier about, I don't want people to drive to work. I don't want people to, be afraid to use their licenses in their everyday lives. Because I completely understand the fear. The state is wildly unpredictable and clearly knows no bounds and will stoop to, who knows how low, to hurt trans folks. We know that. But the statutes that they cite when they use this fear-mongering language about fraud and misrepresentation of your gender and all of that, they have an additional component other than just none of this fits within fraud, the definition of fraud or any of that. But the additional component is that they have to show that you knowingly made a false statement, you knowingly committed fraud, you knowingly concealed a material fact. And for everyone that already updated their driver's licenses prior to this, there's no way that you could have anticipated. I mean, maybe you could have anticipated we're in Florida, but there's no way that you could have known that in the future, hypothetically, they were going to change their interpretation of this and, make it change the policy to say what it is now, right? And also, even right now, today, with this in place, if you go amend your driver's license or get a new driver's license or renew, and your primary identification document shows your correct gender, your affirmed gender, there is no way that they could say that you are knowingly engaging in fraud when you're complying with the exact directive that they put out in a technical advisory 2 days ago.
Thanks for that, Simone. Well, this has been a lot. Before we shift into moving legislation, is there anything else that folks should know at home about this memo?
I mean, I think based on a lot of the questions in the chat, I just want to make sure folks, and I think Carlos is going to get into this and make very clear the difference between the bill that's being proposed and this. But to be clear, this memo and this technical advisory do not say original birth certificate. They do not say birth certificate at the time of birth. None of that is present here. That's the bill. Do we think that the DHSMV was anticipating this would pass and kind of counting their chickens before they hatched? Yes, but as it stands now, nothing says original birth certificate or as filed at the time of birth. And also just to address some of the common questions I'm seeing, we will challenge this. Unfortunately, there's so many terrible laws and rules that we're already litigating at Southern Legal Counsel that there's a lot to challenge here, but should it become necessary to file federal litigation to challenge this, we will do so. If you are denied the ability to amend your gender marker, to renew your license, to get a new license reflecting your gender identity, contact us and we will help.
Can I jump in here with an additional comment and then a question before we get into the legislation? So one of the takeaways that I have so far from this conversation, as far as what can people do to perhaps prepare themselves for what's to come, one of the suggestions you threw out there was if they are able to have their U.S. passport updated with their updated gender marker that reflects their gender identity. Of course, that's for people who have a U.S. passport and are able to do so. It also reminds me, because there was some comments in the chat that I want to bring to your attention, that there are some additional challenges and obstacles for folks who are not U.S. citizens, but who are residents of the state. For example, if you're a non-citizen, you can't renew your driver license or your ID online. You have to, I believe, go into the office and do this in person. Do you have any recommendation for folks who are not U.S. citizens on things that they can be doing?
Yeah, so whatever immigration document you may be relevant to you that you may have, there is a mechanism by which you can update the name and gender marker. We're not, this doesn't involve name, this is just gender marker, but there is a way to update the gender marker on naturalization certificates and green cards and all sorts of documents that might be that might be the primary identification document for you, as opposed to a U.S. passport. So because right now we're in a position where the federal regulations and requirements are much more affirming than the state level ones, whatever federal documentation you have, and folks should update their social security records for those that's relevant as well. But immigration documents can be updated. So, reach out to me if you have questions or need help with that, but let's get that done first and then use that as your primary identification document for purposes of your driver's license. And while they don't say a social security, card is a primary identification document, what folks should know is that every time someone is getting a driver's license or updating a driver's license, renewing it, they cross-check social security. They will always make sure that at least the name is consistent. So if the gender marker and name on your social security are your affirmed name and affirmed gender marker, that's just another added point, for why it should be consistent, and they likely won't think twice about it. So definitely update every federal document that you have. And if you have questions, reach out to me and I can help you.
Yes, and how can they reach out to you specifically, Simone, or Southern Legal Counsel, if they have those types of questions?
I might be bad at technology, and by that I mean I am, so I can't figure out how to write in the chat without logging into YouTube. But if someone could put my email in the chat, that'd be great. It's simone.chris@southernlegal.org.
Thank you, Simone.
Love that. And Quinn, we do have another question that I think is important to ask. And this one I anticipated, but I did see it in the chat as well, which is a reminder that this is on people's minds. Look, I mean, we are, much of what is happening in this discussion is we are also speculating on how we think the state is going to enforce this new decree and how they should enforce it, as much as we oppose it. This question basically says, what if people are stopped by police and questioned about their gender? Can they say their gender marker was changed before the new policy? Look, I mean, we know that the way that information gets out there about some of these new policies or decrees, you can have cops and law enforcement watching Fox News and seeing, trans people are not allowed to have an updated driver license, and they could start harassing someone who does have an updated ID. What's your recommendation around that? Is it okay for someone to disclose to law enforcement that they have an updated gender marker on their ID, which of course is compliant with the state's previous rules.
So can you just state the actual question one more time?
Yes. My apologies. The question being, what if someone is stopped by police and questioned about their gender? Can they say the gender marker was changed before the new policy? That was the question.
Okay. Yeah. So if they're stopped by police and they have any fear of the police taking it upon themselves to enforce this DHSMV memo, okay, so that should not be happening. That would be bananas. I can't imagine that they've even adequately conveyed this to the DMV workers that are actually have enforcement authority, no less like law enforcement officers. But yes, absolutely. Know your rights. Say, my gender marker was amended prior to this, policy change. And always in interactions with police, I've done a ton of training of police departments on trans rights issues and when a person's ID doesn't match maybe their gender expression and gender identity. I say always err on the side of like, my ID says this is who I am, like not letting it escalate unnecessarily for any reason, explaining, I haven't yet updated my ID, but XYZ, just because it's so not worth a unnecessary escalation in a situation like that with a police officer. But police officers should not be enforcing this. Just so folks know, the only way the criminal penalty provision would be enforced by a law enforcement officer is if like a court finds that you've committed fraud, says that you need to have your driver's license suspended or revoked. The DMV tries to do so. You refuse to comply. You won't give it up. And then a warrant is issued for your arrest. And there are so many steps before we get there. So hopefully that is not something anyone has to even think about.
Well, and people are understandably nervous about this new decree. This is an administration that has certainly done everything to earn our distrust of how they will enforce this policy, because we know the DeSantis administration is a bigoted anti-trans administration that is doing everything that it can to make people's lives harder. They rolled this new decree out intentionally in this way to cause as much chaos and disruption as possible. Simone, you're obviously very, very popular with folks in the audience. So I just want to repeat again that if you need to get in contact with our legal eagle here, Simone Chris with Southern Legal, her email address is simone.chris@southernlegal.org. And you can see how to spell her name right up there in the description. Simone.chris@southernlegal.org. Everyone wants to reach out to you. Sorry if your email blows up after this, Simone, but a lot of people have their questions, and we're just so grateful to you for making yourself available to kind of ease some of their concerns.
We are. Thank you, Simone. And just one last question on this topic. I know that we are reserving time at the end for audience Q&A, but there were a few mentions in the chat about any implications this might have for the voter registration process. If you might be able to just touch on that before we move into the legislation.
Yeah, for voter registration, that's a good question.
I mean, this is a tricky one. So every time I do like a name and gender marker change clinic and assist folks with this process, I make sure they have the voter ID update amendment form to make sure that their voter registration matches their new ID. I think as long as you have consistency among at least one document and your voter registration, your voter record, you should be okay. I've run into some issues where I've had to fight for people's ballots to be counted because the signature didn't match. Like, they changed their name. The signature isn't the same because it's not the same name. But these people are dense sometimes. No offense to the people working in the polls. They're great. So I would just say if you do update your ID, make sure that you also update your voter registration. And if you have any issues with that, reach out to me if you don't know how to do so.
Well, I think we all do now, but thank you so much, Simone. Okay, pivoting to Carlos. So Carlos, at the
Everyone has Simone's email. I love it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Simone. So Carlos, at the same time that this memo was released this week, we also have HB 1639 moving through the legislature. We attended a hearing just this morning. We saw dozens of advocates. There were 30 speakers in opposition to this bill at the Capitol opposing this bill and its serious risks for the transgender and non-binary communities in Florida. Carlos, this is a sweeping bill, but for tonight's purposes, can you tell us what this bill says about driver's licenses and state-issued ID cards?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, this bill was in committee today. This is House Bill 1639, also known as the Trans Erasure Bill. This legislation was proposed in the Florida House of Representatives by Representative Doug Bankston. Sorry, I apologize. And basically what the bill does is it rewrites Florida law to impose a new restrictive definition of sex that is based exclusively on sex assigned at birth and excludes transgender Floridians. Ultimately, if this proposal is passed through the legislature and signed by the governor, that means that Florida law will require a driver license or ID card to state the applicant's sex at birth, not their gender. And it's going to make much of what FLHSMV has implemented with this new decree that we've been talking about all night. It will make a lot of that permanent. This bill is not the law yet, though. It's moving through the process. But it's not just limited to the ID part. I do want to make sure folks know that HB 1639 also prohibits trans Floridians from acquiring accurate state IDs. We know that it could dissuade them from actually getting driver licenses ultimately, or carry documentation that is not aligned with their gender identity. But it goes further than that. It also requires that any Floridian whose insurance policy includes gender affirming care, whether that person is trans or not, that they must pay an additional premium, effectively mandating higher insurance costs. It mandates that all Florida healthcare plans also cover anti-trans conversion therapy, which we all know conversion therapy. We all know what conversion therapy is. It's a dangerous and a debunked practice that falsely claims to be able to turn trans people cis or to turn gay people straight. Ultimately, this bill is really just about putting up more obstacles for transgender adults seeking medically necessary care. It denies them legal existence through all of these ID and driver license provisions. But Equality Florida is in the Capitol every single day with many others opposing this law at every turn, as we did today in committee.
That's right. And we know the importance of having access to affirming IDs. Not only does it reduce rates of discrimination and violence in everyday interactions, but it's also been shown to reduce the risk of suicide rates. So this is a critically important document that we do need access to. So thank you for that legislative update, Carlos. We're almost halfway through the legislative session at this point. So where is this bill 1639 in the process, and what are the likely next steps?
So this trans erasure bill is just past its second of 3 House committees. After it passes a third House committee, it will head to the House floor for a full vote there, where it would likely pass. Now, the big caveat I want to put out there, because we've all seen the bill on Capitol Hill cartoon, we know how a bill becomes a law. Same in the legislature. It's got to pass both the House and Senate chamber in identical forms before it can be sent to, in this case, the governor to sign it into law. The caveat here and the somewhat good news is that there is no Senate bill for this House bill, which does not make it impossible for this bill to pass. It just makes it a little harder because it will have some additional hurdles that it has to go through over in the Senate if it does not have a bill that's actively moving there right now, which it does not. It could be amended onto another bill, though. There's a lot of other paths. So we are watching this bill very closely, and we are showing up to every committee to oppose it.
That's right. And we don't yet know when the next committee hearing on this bill will be scheduled for. They have a 48-hour notice period. And this bill now sits before the Infrastructure Strategies Committee. And their next scheduled meeting is next Thursday, February 8th at 8 a.m. But we will not know until next Wednesday at the earliest whether this bill will be heard for a third time next week. But we will absolutely let everyone know as soon as we do. And Carlos, how are other ways people can get involved in this fight against HB 1639?
Well, they can do a couple of things, a couple of suggestions, and we've put this actually in the comments right now on social media. If they cannot make it to Tallahassee, we certainly want you to reach out to your state representative and your state senator to express your opposition to this trans erasure bill 1639. You can do that by actually clicking on one of the links that we put out there in the comments, where you can send a message to your state rep and to your state senator to let them know that you oppose. Now, that's if you can't make it to Tallahassee. And by the way, we know making it to Tallahassee is a huge, huge challenge for a lot of folks, especially since it's so far from so many of the population centers. But session ends at the beginning of March. What's the date, Quinn? I think it's March 6th. Is that right?
8th. You're very close. The 8th. Yes.
March 8th. Thank you, Quinn. Session is a 60-day session, meaning if you can make it to Tallahassee any week in the next several weeks up until March 8th, we want you to join us because our pride at the Capitol that we've been bringing folks up to actually meet with their state senators, meet with their state reps, and be able to oppose these bills through public comment in person and testify in these committees to really make sure that your voice is heard. We're doing that through the entire 60 days. We have links in the comments as well, where you can sign up to come up to Tallahassee if you're able to. And of course, you can always go to equalityflorida.org, where we also have those links available. That's our website, equalityflorida.org, to be able to sign up for Pride at the Capitol or to take one of these, send one of these messages to your state reps or senators.
Thank you so much, Carlos. So we are about to get into audience questions, but I know that many of you, like me, are feeling the fear and confusion that this move was intended to create. I just want everyone to know that Equality Florida and our national and local partners are reaching out to all of our resources about how to challenge this memo and its damaging and disruptive impact on our lives. We will absolutely keep you updated as this comes together. But in the meantime, if you're ready to take action, just like Carlos said, please click those links in the chat or in the comment section. Thank you so much. So let's pivot to some audience questions. And I still think there's time. If you have a question that hasn't been answered, drop it in the comment section wherever you are viewing this video. But I'm just gonna run through them. So let's start with, how do the parents of queer adults help ensure their safety? Is this set up for harassment? So the parents of queer adults, how can these parents help ensure that their adult children are safe? Come to Pride at the Capitol, that's what I'll say.
I mean, I want to make sure I understand the question is if you are the parent of a person who is an adult. I mean, I think same with parents of minors. Help your child, whether that child's an adult or a minor, update their documents so that they have legal authenticity, help them access the medical care that they need to live authentically and in accordance with their gender identity. Super importantly, help folks know their rights. Take the information we shared today and share it with 10 people. I have a legal memo that I sent around that most people have probably seen by now that outlines everything I talked about with regard to the DHSMV policy and busts some of the myths. Share it with everyone you know. When we know our rights and we're empowered, it's so much harder for the state to win because they only win when we're afraid and we're uninformed. And so let's not be afraid and uninformed. I also just wanted to really quickly note, if that's okay, a lot of questions have come up about birth certificates. This is a town hall about the driver's license thing that just happened, but just so folks know, birth certificate gender markers are not being amended at the moment. Back in 2018, we compelled the Bureau of Vital Statistics to change their policy to allow gender marker changes with that same letter, just like they did here in the dark without notice. a few months ago. They just changed their interpretation of an existing administrative rule that they had never interpreted this way previously out of nowhere. And they have stopped amending gender markers. I have probably 100 people that have reached out asking for help. And I want everyone on here to know, and everyone that's reached out to me to know, I am helping certain people go through the process, the administrative hearing process, go through the formal hearing to establish a record upon which we can file a lawsuit or do an unadopted rule challenge. These things take time, and I know folks are frustrated, but there's like less than a handful of us in this state doing trans rights litigation. It's so time consuming. It is so expensive. It is so hard. We're working around the clock, but we've challenged the Medicaid ban, SB 254, the Board of Medicine rules, the Don't Say Gay law, the pronoun ban. Like, we're working on it, and I assure you, we will get to a point where we've gotten the birth certificate policy and the driver's license policy back where they need to be. They don't comply with federal law, so please just be patient and know that we are doing everything we can.
So just a quick follow-up to that, since we're talking about federal ID documents, what if someone currently holds a passport with a gender marker X? How might that influence the process here in Florida?
It's a great question. So we were so thrilled about the gender marker X option so that non-binary folks could have a document that reflected their gender identity. Wonderful. However, in this particular moment in time, when you need a primary identification document that reflects the gender that you want reflected on your driver's license, given that X or non-binary is not an option there, that makes it a little harder. I assume that if a person has X on their passport, they likely don't want M or F on their passport, right? And so they likely don't want M or F on their driver's license. But if you feel safer and more comfortable and it more aligned with your gender identity to have one of those gender markers on your driver's license and it isn't your sex assigned at birth, you can amend your passport and then get your driver's license amended to be the one that best reflects your gender identity.
Thank you so much for that. Just staying on this path real quick. So what if someone moves to Florida with an already updated license that does affirm and reflect their gender identity? Are they at any risk when it's time to renew or actually, to get their Florida's driver's license?
So a valid ID from another state is a primary identification document, just like a passport or a birth certificate. So if those folks have already amended their driver's license or ID in that other state to reflect the correct gender marker, then that is the primary identification document that by their own memo, they must reflect the gender marker on your Florida ID based on that.
Thanks, Simone. All right, over to you, Carlos. Does testifying in Tallahassee require your contact info to be made public?
Yes, actually, it does. Whenever you testify in a legislative committee in Tallahassee, which is often the case in school board meetings or local government meetings, you have to put down your name, and I believe it asks for your address, your street address, and your zip code. Quinn, I haven't filled out one of those in a while. Did I describe that accurately?
That is, yes. You need to list your name, contact information, your email address. But
it's a public record, yes. And I understand that can be limiting, and I understand that can be something that maybe potentially someone can be concerned about. But yes, full disclosure, whenever you do make a public comment in a legislative committee, you have to fill out a speaker card, which does ask for some of your information.
Thank you, Carlos. Okay, I am reading these questions right now. So just to recap, is the safest way and our current legal advice to amend our passports as soon as possible if we're able to and qualify for a passport?
Good idea.
Yes. So across the board. So for, what I've been struggling with up until this came out was folks not being able to update their birth certificates. For adults, you really never need your birth certificate. It's very rare that you'll ever need it. For minors, however, for school purposes, it can be super important. So a U.S. passport is a primary legal document, just like a birth certificate. You can enroll a child in school using their passport. You should be able to amend their record using their passport. If you have a school that's not letting you do so, let me know. I'm helping lots of parents with that process. But get a passport if you can't update your birth certificate. Similarly, get a passport so you can update your driver's license, because it is a primary identification document, and they should use that. And again, if you're joining and you didn't hear earlier, update your social security record, update your passport, update any document that you can. And if you need help with this, I created a website called floridanamechange.org, and it has each of the steps for name change, all 67 counties in Florida, social security, passport, birth certificate, all of the above.
Awesome. Thanks, Simone. Okay, so let's get into the legality of this memo. How are they able to just make this change without updating any existing law?
Probably not. They probably
They're
can't.
not.
Which gets us into the will they get sued question. Let's just cut
Yes,
straight to the chase, right?
Yeah, so the way that this is supposed to work is they're supposed to go through a rulemaking process where they, allow public comment. They do a notice of proposed rule. They do all the things we saw them do with the Medicaid ban and the Board of Medicine rules. What I would like, and I'm sure most folks are young enough to remember this last year thing that happened. Do you guys remember the guidance that was put out on April 20th, 2022 by Surgeon General Ladapo saying gender affirming care is bad for youth, including social transition? And it was very scary. It was not pleasant, but it meant nothing. It had no binding legal authority. It was just a memo from Surgeon General Ladapo. It then led to rulemaking processes that were fraudulent and complete garbage. Nevertheless, they were rulemaking processes, and that led to the rules banning gender affirming care. Similarly, this memo in and of itself means nothing. It has no binding authority and no legal weight. So if they then, promulgate rules, we'll let you all know, and you can show up and have your voices heard, and we can try to stop them from doing so. But at this time, this is not an official rule or policy.
Thank you. All right. So looking back to last year's slate of hate, we had the anti-trans bathroom law that was passed. Has anyone been arrested or charged with that vague law that carries potential criminal penalties that passed last year that we know of? And how are we responding to that, if so?
No. From the information that we have, and if anybody has heard of this, please let me know. But I'm fairly certain the answer is no. No one has been arrested under the bathroom laws. And for the most part, they aren't really being enforced. A lot of this, and I think there were comments earlier alluding to this, a lot of this is posturing, it's fear mongering, it's let's make Florida as unsafe and uninhabitable a state as possible so that people leave. But it's not being enforced in a meaningful way. Also, it isn't until July 1st of 2024 that the Attorney General can actually bring penalties against entities that aren't complying with the bathroom law. And so, that's not something that we're seeing at this time.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions about identity documents. So if someone has an original birth certificate that has not yet been updated to reflect their gender identity, but they do have an updated driver's license, what does it mean for when it comes time to renew their license in Florida?
Say that again?
Yeah, so they've updated their driver's license, which now reflects their gender identity. The birth certificate might still reflect the sex assigned at birth. How can they renew their license in Florida?
So a renewal, again, is just a very simple process of renewing the driver's license as is. By their own words, their own agency employees have said this only applies to replacements. And when you renew your license in accordance with the gender marker already on it, that is not a replacement. So this should not be applied in that instance at all.
Very good. So I'm not sure that we have any additional questions at this time. Did Carlos, Simone, any last thoughts on the matter before we close?
Yes, I do have a little bit of cleanup on the question about public comment. I was just informed that really it's about putting your name on the public comment card if you want to come up to Tallahassee and speak and testify in a committee, but you don't have to provide any contact information that you're not comfortable providing. So just wanted to clean that up a little bit and clarify that so that folks feel comfortable if they're able to come to Tallahassee to be able to do so without sharing their information.
Thank you for that clarification. I should probably stop providing all of my information on those cards, but any last thoughts? Simone, Carlos, you have been incredibly helpful this evening, experts in the field. I know we're all super appreciative of your time and your commitment to fighting for our rights and dignities. Any last thoughts?
I'll just jump in and say, look, we know that this is really scary, that this is really frustrating, to say the absolute least. You know, we're working to continue to get clear answers for you to your questions. I've seen a lot of questions there in the chat that we just didn't have time to address directly here in this conversation, but just want to let you know that we're fighting back. Trans and non-binary folks have a right to exist and to live their lives freely without political interference. I see you, I stand with you against this hatred and bigotry, and we're here to get the answers that you need as soon as possible.
Yep, I would just say it can feel really hopeless. It can be a very isolating time, I think, for all of us, those that are being directly impacted by these laws, those whose loved ones are being directly impacted, and those of us who have dedicated our lives and careers to fighting for this community. And I think more than anything, we just all need to support one another. We all need to remind those of us that might not know this, that there are so many of us fighting around the clock against these laws. And ultimately what we've seen across the country, including in Florida, is that once we actually put all the facts and the law out there and we have a trial and we expose these things for what they are, they lose every time, because they know it's unconstitutional. They know these things are wrong and they're doing them anyway. And if you have folks in your life or you're talking to legislators when you go to lobby or whatever, anytime you're talking to someone, if human compassion doesn't work on them, they don't care that this is killing trans people, they don't care about human basic rights and dignity, remind them what an insane waste of taxpayer dollars this is. When we litigated the Medicaid case, before we even got to the litigation, which is the most expensive part, which took almost a year, the state had spent $1.3 million of your money, of taxpayer dollars, bringing in fake experts to create a fake report, to pass a rule banning Medicaid coverage that they knew was wrong. And guess what? After a 2-week trial, we struck it down in federal court. It was deemed unconstitutional. Hopefully, same with SB 254 and all these other things we're litigating. But, figure out what works for the people you're talking to get them to understand why this is just both human, like in a human way, so wrong, so awful, so unconstitutional, but also just such a waste of money and time and resources that could be better spent protecting the people of Florida.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I know this has been a lot to absorb, and we're all still reeling from what this might mean for ourselves and for our families. Equality Florida will continue to share information about this devastating development as we gain additional clarity, and we will always show up to every fight to protect our rights and defend our dignities. We deserve the futures that we have all fought so hard for. So please consider joining us in Tallahassee during the remainder of this legislative session as we continue to fight tooth and nail against this year's anti-LGBTQ bills. And make sure you click through to our action alert and the links in the chat to tell Republicans that enough is enough, that the extremist attacks and state-sanctioned cruelty and discrimination against trans people must come to an end. Thank you again for joining us, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.